Hi there, I'm your host, John Ivison, and I'm delighted to be joined this week by the Honourable Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, for at least another 24 hours or so, right?
Well, probably more like a week or so. There is an interim period before.
Well, I was going to ask, what's the formal process? They don't automatically name the UCP leader and they become Premier, right?
Well, John, I know you're kind of new to the conventions of Westminster democracy, so let me walk it through. After the party elects a new leader tonight, that person becomes UCP leader, United Conservative Party leader. Tomorrow, I will go to visit Her Honor the Lieutenant Governor, offer my resignation effective, and recommend that the new leader be invited to form a government and test the confidence of the Assembly. A date will be set. It's usually 1 to 2 weeks out, and then there's an interim, caretaker period.
You're right. I should know all that. Let me just quick potted history how we got to here. First elected Reform MP 25 years ago. Hardly believable given the youthful figure in front of us here. Held 3 ministerial positions in the Harper government: immigration, employment and defence. Left Ottawa in 2016 to unite the right in Alberta. Was elected the 18th Premier of the province in 2019. Won a leadership review in May, but decided the 51.4% support was not a large enough mandate to govern, and you decided to step down, which you will do Thursday when the next leader of the UCP is announced. So anyway, Premier, thank you for joining me. I want to just look back at the past year. Does it suggest to you that Alberta has become ungovernable, that you can only win the backing of a large faction of the UCP's support by promising legislation like Danielle Smith has done, the Alberta Sovereignty Act, which essentially says ignore federal legislation? You've called that a full frontal assault on the rule of law. I mean, this is not your tradition of conservatism. Well,
first of all, we don't know who will win, so I'm not going to prejudge that. Secondly, right. Yeah, John, look, you ask a very good question. I spent 3 years working hard to reunite a deeply divided right-of-center movement here, which for a long time has had, sort of broadly speaking, 2 currents: a kind of populist, more rural current, and a sort of more traditional Tory, more urban current. And they were expressed in the Wild Rose and PC parties. And, I did it by focusing on what united us, the central point of which was getting rid of the NDP and not dividing the vote. And we won a smashing electoral victory. Over the first time ever, a governing party, any party, won over 1 million votes in Alberta. We put together a very carefully calibrated platform that addressed all of the different constituent elements of our pretty diverse coalition. And we were cooking with gas as a government in our first year or so. But then we walked into a crisis that was almost like purpose-built to divide a coalition like ours. Because COVID, of course, forced governments to make impossibly difficult decisions. And there's a big polarization in Alberta. I'm not going to hide it. We, in addition to the tensions in my party, we also have a pretty significant left here. And so we had a large cohort wanted hard and sustained lockdowns, Quebec style. Another group wanted no restrictions at all. And then a smaller minority that became pretty hostile about vaccines. And that's where a lot of the energy from our politics has come out of in the past year. That was clear in my leadership review vote, where over half the people voting in the review vote had never been PC, Wild Rose, or United Conservative members, overwhelmingly from rural areas. And it's clear. If reporters like you wouldn't have seen this, but if you were to go to community halls in many parts of rural Alberta in January and February of this year, there were hundreds and sometimes thousands of people showing up to rally against COVID policy, vaccines, etc. And so there was a radicalization that took place. My hope, John, is that as COVID recedes, so too do those divisions. I do think there is the ability to maintain a Big Ten coalition here. Peter Lougheed and Ralph Klein did it before it fractured. And I think we could get back to that, but not if one of the central themes of the party becomes recrimination over COVID policy, firing doctors and scientists at the College of Physicians, or pursuing de facto separatist policies. So If the party wants to stay united, and if it wants to get reelected, my appeal would be to stay in touch with the broad mainstream. That doesn't mean being a centrist party. It means being a mainstream conservative party. Honor and respect all the constituent elements of your coalition, but don't get jerked away into a ditch of marginal issues, particularly through a kind of endless relitigation of COVID.
I mean, the 2 years of COVID were pretty intense, and that ended up, as you say, breaking up the coalition. But it seemed to me it was always quite fragile. And I remember writing about you were performing political funambulism, which is political tightrope walking. You were encouraging outrage at Ottawa's what you saw as anti-energy policies, and attempting to constrain what you've called the animal spirits of some of the more radical elements. I mean, I remember the quote from Ted Morton, the former finance minister, who said, if you as Premier were going to go too fast, you would lose moderates, and if you went too slow, you risked Wexit or other groups rising up, as appears to have happened. Do you think that you went too slow or too fast, or was it just impossible to reconcile those two groups?
John, history will tell. I think, honestly, if you look at our first pre-COVID year, we were going we had the Goldilocks solution. John, there is a deep frustration in this province that's not from the hard right about Ottawa, okay? And I think you know that, right? It's pretty widespread, and I think it's well justified. And what I was trying consciously to do was unapologetically to make if you will, a populist appeal to that frustration about Ottawa, but to channel it in a constructive direction. John, I think even my worst critics on the left would have to admit that I've never toyed with separation. I've always been clear that...
but they did accuse you of fanning the flames. Well,
here's the point. The left's response is to tell those people to shut up and go home and to suck it up. And that's what fans the flames of frustration. Rachel Notley making a deal with Justin Trudeau that killed the Northern Gateway pipeline, that surrendered on Keystone XL, it gave him carte blanche to kill Energy East, the carbon tax, etc. That's what fans the flames. A government that within the bounds of the rule of law and of federalism challenged damaging policies is very much in the spirit of my Alberta predecessors like Peter Lougheed. So our constitutional challenge to the carbon tax, to the Impact Assessment Act C-69, are getting other provinces to support us, strength in numbers, unity across the Federation. These are the kind of assertive policies that I think people here wanted. So I've always been clear that my federalism is unconditional. It's like, I don't think you go into a marriage and say if you don't shape up, I'm out of here tomorrow. This is not how you behave in a federation. And so that angered some people. But John, we have always had a couple of marginal right parties here that play in the hard populist fringe, even under Lougheed and Klein. It depended on the election. They might get 6 to 10% of the popular vote, primarily in a handful of rural ridings, occasionally elect one MLA. Every now and then a separatist MLA would pop up. That's always been a factor. What I think may be different now is some of those folks trying to take over the mainstream Conservative Party.
I remember when you became Minister of Employment, you were kind of outraged and said you never envisioned yourself as the Minister of Welfare. Did you have a similar sense as Premier circumscribing individual liberties during COVID?
Yes.
Would you have done anything differently if you had your time over?
Well, it was... people could see this. I think it was plainly painful for me and many of my government to do any of these restrictions. You don't have anybody who got into office, let alone as an Alberta Conservative, to impose unprecedented restrictions on the exercise of people's normal lives and liberties. So it was obvious, and I got whacked from the left and many of your friends in the media, and Prime Minister Trudeau and others, yes, for being reluctant to bring the restrictions. But I don't regret that. And here's my defense. We exit COVID, please God, with a lower per capita fatality rate than Canada, lower than 3 other provinces, with the lightest restrictions and therefore the least damaging restrictions in Canada. Not a coincidence, we have the strongest economic rebound and recovery. Was it a perfect response? Absolutely not. But unlike other provinces, we never had to ship an ICU patient out of the province. We never had to triage people, unlike some other provinces. So I think that response, all in context, is more than defensible. But it was deeply divisive in our coalition. And the part that surprised me most, I got to be honest about this, was vaccines. I mean, I'm passionate about a lot of it. I'm skeptical about elite opinion on a number of questions, and that's what gives me a bit of a populist edge. But I've never been skeptical about science, basic medical science, and I've never thought that I can second guess medical science on the best treatments and preventions for a disease. But we have had in Alberta, a larger share of the population who've been really radicalized by that stuff. You know, and they don't listen to folks like you and traditional media at all.
Wait,
John, one of my problems during COVID,
populism with a snarl.
Yeah, well, I would say populism with the snarl is, I guess, one way I've put it. You know, at the height of COVID, if I had to come out and say, I'm really terribly sorry about this, but we're going to have to impose some restrictions because we're running out of hospital beds, I discovered that a large segment of my population never heard me say that, because they were watching some web-based anger merchant telling them that the hospitals were empty and nurses were doing TikTok videos. So here I am. I suddenly felt like I'd lost the ability to communicate with a fairly significant number of people here. That's a bigger concern for our democracy.
What can you do about that? I mean, I know some politicians want to go around the media, but it looks like many of these people that are going around the media. How do politicians respond and reach them?
No easy formula on that, obviously, is there? And it's, by the way, it's not just a problem on the right. The polarization is on both sides. I don't want to eschew responsibility, but this is not directed at you, John, but I do think that that a lot of stuff coming from what you might call mainstream legacy traditional media has created a total lack of confidence on people on the right generally. I know a lot of what you call very, very moderate red Tories who have basically given up on most of mainstream media. And I think media needs to take that into account as well. You know, when you look at some of the stuff, I will point fingers. The Toronto Star, you know, on their front page, running above the whole fold headlines about wishing that the unvaccinated would die, things like that. You know, I am an unapologetic supporter of the vaccines. That's one of the reasons that I will soon be a former premier. But there was a certain nastiness that inflamed those sentiments. We saw that in the trucker convoy. I was opposed to what they did, but sympathetic to some of their goals. Some of these are ordinary working people who are being put out of work for their medical decisions, and their lives have been disrupted, and elites were just mocking them. Prime Minister basically calling them all racists and misogynists. So look, John, I think there's a lot of stock taking to be done about the divisions that have been created.
Earlier, you were just talking about how you were in a tradition of premiers in Alberta standing up to Ottawa. I mean, it seemed to me, looking relatively objectively, that you were standing up for Alberta when you came to Ottawa, and presumably you were at home too. This Fair Deal panel looking at how you would collect provincial taxes, potentially ending the contract with the RCMP, withdrawing from CPP. Do you think you were treated unfairly by those who portrayed you as a sellout to Ottawa?
Yes. I maintain that no premier since Brownlee got the National Resource Transfer Agreement in 1932 has done more to assert Alberta autonomy in the Federation. We got an agreement from Ottawa that gave us control over regulating major carbon emissions. An agreement that gave us the power to regulate methane regulations. These are multi-billion-dollar wins for Alberta and our largest industry. We got control over managing northern habitat regulations because the feds were looking at sterilizing a third of the landmass of northern Alberta. It would have been economically devastating. We got control over that. We got them to lift the cap on the fiscal stabilization program. That was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We created an Alberta provincial parole board, an Alberta chief firearms officer to bring common sense to the application of federal firearms legislation. We got $1 billion out of the feds for well site reclamation to put good blue collar people to work during the COVID crisis. We got continued construction on TMX, Trans Mountain Expansion, existential for our economic future, and a heck of a lot more. We've started the necessary work to lay the foundations for a provincial police force and a provincial pension plan. So we've done all of that and much more. But frankly, what I have found is the folks who are angry, they're not actually looking for solutions by and large. They're just looking to burn things down, starting with the Federation itself. And I'm sorry if I'm not their candidate. Not sorry.
Long career, 25 years. What are you most proud of in all your federal or provincial portfolios that you've held?
Oh, I could go on a lot. I mean, look, I'll just say one thing federally, two things federally. The big immigration reforms were hugely challenging, important work. Secondly, deploying the Canadian military to Ukraine in Operation Unifier in 2015 that helped to prepare them for the incredibly effective punch in the face that they're giving Vladimir Putin right now. I just had dinner last night with General Rick Hillier, and both he and former President Poroshenko tell me that operation and some other things that I did as MND for Ukraine were a huge difference maker. Here in Alberta, the economic renaissance that we're going through is not a coincidence. This is a government that's been obsessively focused on pro-growth economic reforms. But finally, the one that gets me emotional is the work we've done on Indigenous reconciliation, and I call it reconciliation. Last week, I stood on a stage with representatives of 23 First Nations. Thanks to a policy of our government, we backstopped their co-ownership of 7 pipelines that will produce hundreds of millions of dollars of direct economic benefits as they increasingly become owners of resource industries to develop the resources that below the lands that their ancestors inhabited. And embarking on a new age of economic opportunity for these First Nations. And the next day, I was at an event where I signed over control over the most sacred object of the Plains Indians, the Creator Stone, the Manitou Stone, that had been stolen by a missionary in 1866, sent to Toronto. We came back to Alberta, but it's been stuck in a museum ever since. And a chief came up to me the other day and said, the elders had a prophecy that if the stone disappeared, so too would our way of life, the buffalo, and we would live in a time of great poverty. He said, you've given us back the Creator's stone, and in the same week, given us back a path to prosperity and healing. It's like the prophecy is being reversed. And I must tell you, I'm a pretty stoic guy, but that had me teared up. And so there's a lot of amazing things happening here on the First Nation with the First Nations. And just in the last week, I've been honored to receive my Blackfoot and Cree names. Blackfoot name, Brave Horse, and my Cree name, Standing Rock. So after 25 years,
don't you have there's a Chinese community named Smiling Buddha as well?
Yeah, Xiaofu, Smiling Buddha. So after 25 years in public life, Standing Rock, I'd like to take that as a metaphor. I'm still standing.
It's incredible that the goodwill that's bought by these symbolic gestures. I remember the Stone of Destiny in Scotland, a similar deal.
The symbols are necessary, but they're not sufficient. That's where the reconciliation part comes. And I don't know if the national media is following the story here, but a game-changing in $1 billion equity investment in a series of pipelines is going to set the pattern for the future, for pipelines, for everything. I just am so grateful to have been able to play a role in that.
Just moving on to the modern federal Conservative Party. I remember when you came to Parliament Hill in 2018 and Pierre Poilievre was alongside you, and you joked that he's my former intern, I taught him everything he knows. And, I think there's an element of truth to that. I think a lot of his parliamentary performance skills and audaciousness, perhaps, he learned at the foot of the master in the early 2000s. How do you think he's doing? And do you think he's gone too far in appealing to those animal spirits you were referring to earlier?
Well, John, I'll be honest. I had some concerns about that during the leadership campaign, but I think he's really allayed those concerns since his victory. In his victory speech and since, he has been laser focused on his strongest appeal, which is his focus on bread and butter, kitchen table issues that the broad Canadian middle class is focused on. Justin Trudeau came to office with this rhetorical focus on the middle class. Increasingly, though, his administration has been obsessed with, woke virtue signaling and incompetent administration of basic public services. Nothing really to do. I believe that Pierre's critique is correct, that this federal government, on both fiscal and monetary policy and much more, has actually aggravated the cost of living crisis and plans to make it even worse. And I think he's got an incredibly effective message there, and he's an incredibly effective messenger of it. As long as he stays focused in that wheelhouse, cost of living, cost of housing, cost of energy, the aspirations of younger people who feel locked out of the economy, the sense people increasingly have that our best days are behind us. As long as he stays focused in that wheelhouse, and I know he will, because look, I've known Pierre since he was a volunteer in my first campaign when he was 15. He was an intern in my office, I think, at 18 and a staffer at 19. He is incredibly bright, obviously a hugely effective communicator. But I think he's demonstrating, getting refocused on those core issues, that he's also very wise. The Liberals would underestimate him at their great peril.
But you've been through enough campaigns to know that the Liberals and the NDP will throw the kitchen sink at him, and he will be hard-pressed to disavow some of the things he said in the leadership.
Yeah, they will. They already have tried to, and that'll be part of the push and shove. But I really think, John, that the setup for the next federal election is going to be, how do we make the mortgage payments? Why is my 30-year-old kid still living at home? And why is the federal government planning on tripling the cost, the tax on home heating and groceries? Those will be the issues, not what somebody said 3 years prior about the trucker convoy.
One of the things which you were heavily involved with at the federal level was outreach to ethnic communities. I think you, probably more than anybody else, understood the balance between the majority culture and the integration of minorities. And that enabled you to take a more restrictive approach than almost anybody else has been able to do so, and all the while reassuring those communities on the issues that concerned them. You must have been horrified at what happened in 2015, and I guess, is it possible that those people can be persuaded to take another look at the Conservative Party and come back?
Well, that's a very good summary. You're one of the only, I think, journalists who got what I was doing there. I was so in tune with the views of New Canadians. I realized that contrary to maybe like the Toronto Star's miscaricature, that the vast majority of New Canadians came here the legal route and are strongly opposed to queue jumping, fake asylum claims, bogus immigration marriages, citizenship fraud, human smuggling, human trafficking, and the rest of it. And so you're quite right. We went after all of that to tighten up the integrity, partly because I said if you want to maintain a pro-immigration consensus in Canadian politics, you need to show the system has integrity. Otherwise, you get backlash, like in the US and Europe, where millions of people are able to come in illegally, and it undermines confidence in the whole system. And somehow, with that delicate balance, we managed to win more votes amongst new Canadians in the 2011 election, that was Harper's majority, than we did amongst people native-born Canadians. And it was deeply regretful for me to see the Conservatives lose that, and then lose it further and then further. I think it can be regained, that support, but it's not. It requires constant relationship building, real care in how you manage various issues. I'll give you an example, John. You know full well that I was the ultimate hawk on the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing in the Harper government. I was blamed for supposedly blowing up the Canada-China relationship, and yet, partly through my work, we won the significant majority of the Chinese Canadian vote and those constituencies. All of them were lost in the last election because those issues were not. You can address the issues without causing people to lose face. So it requires great care and a degree of skill. I think Pierre's up to that. But fundamentally, the values of New Canadians are conservative values, aspirational, entrepreneurial, intolerant of social disorder and crime. People don't come here to live a seminar on political correctness, but to get ahead. So I really think that value connection can be there, but you don't capture that by accident. It requires constant work.
Just in closing, I've covered you for more than 20 years. I think I mentioned you can be audacious to the point of outrageousness, very sociable when Guinness is involved, but personally, something of a loner, a very private individual with a strong faith. How do you reconcile that apparent contradiction?
I remember one of my teachers wrote in I don't know why, in a report saying Jason is a unique combination of introvert and extrovert. Probably picking up different aspects of my parents. My dad was a real gregarious Irish extrovert. My mom much less so. And I don't know. I think you know that in my political life, I don't know how to do things in half measures, right? So I used to do 600 plus ethnic events a year, plus carry one of the heaviest burdens in cabinet for Stephen Harper, just work myself to the bone, at least metaphorically, not actually. And so I do need quiet time personally every now and then to try to get the energy for that. Look, John, after 25 years of this, when they gave me the number for the leadership review vote in May, my first response was surprise. We thought we were doing much better. My second response was relief and a sense of pending freedom. So I do leave with no regrets. I've paid my dues and then some. I have a lot of accomplishments about which to be proud. I've served in some of the most privileged positions. I think the best job in Canada, Premier of Alberta. I have nothing left to prove, and I am looking forward to knowing what a weekend is, to be able to sleep in a little bit, to read more broadly, to have time to write, reflect, and take on new challenges. I know that sounds like cliche, but it's absolutely true. I'm excited about it.
But you're only 54. I mean, unless you're going to engage in Freedom 55, which I can't imagine you would, there must be a third act in you. What might that be? What absorbs you?
People come up to me and say, well, we wish you luck in your retirement. I mean, I take that as an insult. Stephen Harper told me after the 2015 election, he sat down and planned out his next stage, and he decided, first point, he's never going to retire. Neither will I.
So what absorbs you?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think I need a bit of a mini sabbatical. Immediately I'll continue to serve as an MLA. We'll sort out the midterm. But I would like to take on some new challenges in the private sector. I think I have something to bring. But I hope to carve out enough time that I can continue to opine on public issues that I'm passionate about. And I don't mean electorally. I don't mean being a partisan pundit. God forbid I should ever be one of those shows that you appear on all the time as a strategist. But you might see me writing long-form pieces for think tanks on issues and themes that I do have some depth and expertise on and a lot of passion about. Things like Indigenous economic development, immigration policy, certain aspects of foreign policy, labor market reform, the federation, free trade within Canada. Some of the things that I've really focused on, you'll see me speak more to in the future.
Well, we wish you well in all of that, and if you feel the urge to opine on this show, you're more than welcome to come back.
Thank you so much, John.
Be well.
God bless.